My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. Not from cold. It was October, yes, but the heater was working fine. They were shaking because of what was sitting behind me in the back of that vehicle, because of what I could feel, even through the partition, even through the sealed casket, even through the 47 kilometers I still had to drive before I reached the highway junction at Lodi. Something was wrong. Something was profoundly, inexplicably wrong. And I had been driving the dead for 22 years. I knew what a corpse felt like in the back of a hearse. I knew the weight. I knew the silence. I knew the particular quality of stillness that settles behind you when you carry someone who has stopped being a person and has become, in the language of my profession, a body in transit. I had driven more than 3,000 families through the worst moments of their lives. I had learned not to think about who was behind me. You had to, otherwise you couldn't do the job. But this was different. This was nothing like any of the 3,000 times before. And what I felt that night, I won't tell you yet what it was. Not exactly. Because if I tell you now, you won't believe me. You have to understand first who I was. You have to understand what kind of man climbed into that cab on the morning of the 14th of October, 2006, and drove north toward Milan before the sun was up. But there are three things I need to plant in your mind right now, before I go any further, because they're the three things that kept me silent for 19 years. The first, what I heard inside that vehicle on the A1 motorway, between the junction at Piacenza and the exit for Fidenza, at approximately 11:47 in the morning. I checked the clock. I checked it twice. The second, what the boy's mother said to me at the gates of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Assisi, which she could not have known, which she had no way of knowing, which still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up when I think about it. And the third, this is the one that took me 19 years to understand. The small, sealed envelope that Carlo Acutis had asked someone to give to me before I ever set foot in that funeral home. An envelope addressed to a man he had never met. An envelope I carried in the inner breast pocket of my work jacket for 19 years without opening it, because the instructions written on the outside said, in the handwriting of a 15-year-old boy, asterisk, open this when you are ready to believe, asterisk. I wasn't ready for a very long time. My name is Gianluca Ferretti. I was a licensed funeral transport driver in the Lombardy region of Italy for 31 years. I am 64 years old now. I have a Class E transport certification, number LO3847TF, issued by the Lombardy Regional Authority in 1993. I am not a religious man, or rather, I was not a religious man. I am the kind of person who spent decades doing a job that most people don't want to think about, and who told himself that doing it well was enough. No drama, no philosophy, just the road, the vehicle, and the duty. For 19 years, I kept what happened on that October morning locked in a part of my mind I didn't visit. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I had been tired. I told myself grief is contagious, and sometimes it reaches you through the walls of a hearse if you're not careful. But the envelope was always there, in the drawer of my bedside table eventually. Still sealed, still waiting. Today I tell it all, every kilometer, every measurement, everything I couldn't explain then and can barely explain now, starting with why my hands were shaking on the A1 motorway, and ending with what was written inside that envelope. I had been working at Impresa Funebre Bilotti in Monza for 11 years when the call came in. It was the 13th of October, 2006, a Friday, the day after Carlo Acutis died at the San Gerardo Hospital at approximately 6:45 in the morning from acute promyelocytic leukemia, N3 classification, which had been diagnosed only 4 days before he died. He was 15 years old. My supervisor at Bilotti, a man named Renato Gaspari, 60 years old, been in the business since 1974, called me at 6 in the morning and told me there was a collection from San Gerardo that needed to be handled with particular care. The family, he said, was well connected in the Milanese community. They were people of faith. There would be a short viewing period, and then we had the transport contract for a long-distance conveyance, Monza to Assisi, approximately 480 kilometers, with a stop at the Sanctuary of the Immaculate Conception in Assisi, before the interment at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. He told me to prepare Vehicle 7. Vehicle 7 was our newest Mercedes-Benz Vito long-wheelbase hearse, registered in 2004, with temperature-controlled interior cargo space. He told me to have it ready by 8. I didn't ask questions. In 22 years, I had learned to keep my questions to myself. You don't ask about the dead. You receive the paperwork, you check the seals on the casket, you confirm the route, and you drive. The paperwork arrived at the funeral home at 8:15. I read through it in the break room with a coffee. Carlo Acutis, born 3rd of May, 1991, in London to Italian parents. Cause of death, acute promyelocytic leukemia. Time of death, 06:45, 12th of October, 2006. Age at death, 15 years, 5 months, 9 days. 15 years old. I put down the coffee. I looked at the wall for a moment. Then I picked the coffee back up and finished it, because that was what you did. You didn't let the age reach you. You couldn't. The casket was sealed by the time I arrived at the San Gerardo loading bay at 9:30 on the morning of the 14th. I signed the transport documents, reference number MO20061014ACU, which I have kept a copy of to this day, and I confirmed the seal identification codes with the hospital's administrative staff. 2 wax seals with the municipal code MO7734, both intact, both stamped with the date of the 14th. I checked the temperature of the cargo space, 14 degrees Celsius, appropriate for a sealed casket in autumn transport conditions. I noted it in my logbook, as I did for every journey. I loaded the casket with my assistant that morning, a younger man named Stefano, 28 years old, who had been with Bilotti for 3 years. We used the hydraulic loading system. The casket was a standard Pompe Funebri model in light oak, sealed with 6 external fixings. Weight on the scale indicator, 84 kilograms total. Stefano was supposed to ride with me to Assisi. He had his travel bag packed. He had called his wife to tell her he'd be back by evening. But at 9:55, before we left the bay, Stefano received a call from his wife. Their youngest son, 18 months old, had developed a high fever overnight, 40.2 degrees Celsius, and she was frightened. Stefano looked at me. I told him to go. I'd driven longer routes alone before. I knew the A1 South. I'd done the Monza to Florence run 6 times in the previous 3 years. He thanked me and left. I wrote his departure in the logbook at 10:03. And so it was just me and the vehicle and whatever was in the back. I set off south at 10:08. The first hour was ordinary. The traffic through Monza was normal for a Saturday morning. I merged onto the A1 at the Sesto San Giovanni junction at 10:41, and I set the cruise control to 110 kilometers per hour. The sky was overcast. The forecast was for light rain south of Parma. I had a paper bag on the passenger seat with 2 Trumazzini sandwiches and a small bottle of mineral water. I had the radio on. The 11 o'clock news was about the elections in Brazil. I was thinking about nothing in particular. And then, at 10:56, I know the exact time because I looked at the dashboard clock the moment it happened. I felt something change in the vehicle. Not heard, felt. The temperature in the cab dropped, very slightly, in the way a room drops when someone opens a window somewhere down the hall. Not dramatic, not frightening, just a shift. I told myself the heating unit was fluctuating. I reached for the temperature dial and checked it. It was set to 22 degrees. The display on the climate unit read 19.4 degrees Celsius in the cab. I turned the dial up 2 degrees, but there was something else beneath the temperature drop, something I couldn't quantify with a dial or a display. The particular quality of the silence in the back of the vehicle had changed. I had described it already as a silence. but I want to be more precise because this matters. In normal transport conditions, there is a kind of neutral weight to the silence behind the partition. It is absence. When you carry someone in a casket, the silence behind you is the silence of emptiness, of a life that has evacuated and left the container behind. I had learned over 22 years to recognize that silence the way a boat captain recognizes still water. This was not that silence. What I felt behind me from 10:56 onward was not the silence of emptiness, it was the silence of attention, as if something behind that partition was present. I am aware of how that sounds. I am aware that I am a former funeral driver with a Class E transport certification, describing a feeling he had in the back of a Mercedes-Benz Vito, and that no one at any transport authority would file that under relevant incident. I know, but you asked me to tell it all, and so I am telling it all. I passed the Lodi exit at 11:14. The feeling did not go away. I turned the radio off without deciding to. And then I noticed the fourth thing, the one I hadn't planned to mention yet, but which I need to plant here because it becomes important in Block 5. The cargo temperature display, which was mounted on a small panel to the right of the steering column and which showed me the interior temperature of the cargo space in real time. It had been reading 14 degrees Celsius since I loaded the casket in Monza. At 11:14, the display read 14.2 degrees, a 0.2 fluctuation. Normal. Equipment variation, possibly. I noted it in the logbook at the next rest point. Mental note, intending to log it properly at the Fidenza stop. But something about that number didn't fit. 0.2 of a degree above baseline in a sealed cargo space in a vehicle where the external temperature was 9 degrees Celsius. In correct transport conditions, the cargo space should have been losing heat, not gaining it. At 11:41, I reached the junction at Piacenza. The A1 opened out here, 3 lanes in each direction, and the Saturday traffic was light. I was making good time. Assisi was still 312 kilometers south. I calculated I'd arrive before 4 in the afternoon. At 11:47, I know this because I looked at the clock, and this was the moment I told you about at the beginning, the moment I said you'd have to wait for. Something happened. I heard something. I want to be precise again, because the precision matters. What I heard was not a knock, not a movement, not the sound of settling timber or the vibration of road surface transferring through the casket fixings, which is something that happens on long transport runs, and which experienced drivers learn to identify and categorize correctly. I knew all those sounds. I had logged them in maintenance reports dozens of times. What I heard was a voice. I know. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was not a shout from behind the partition or a sound that made me swerve the vehicle or lose control. It was quiet and clear, the way you hear someone speak in an empty room. And it was a boy's voice, young, calm. And what it said, in Italian, in the accent of someone who grew up speaking Italian in a household where it was the daily language, what it said was this: "Don't be afraid. Everything is fine." 5 words. I counted them afterward, in my head, the way you count the beats after a car accident to see if your mind is still working. Non aver paura. Va tutto bene. 5 words in Italian. A boy's voice. I pulled the vehicle immediately to the right lane. My heart rate was, I can only describe it as extremely elevated. My hands, already on the wheel, gripped tighter. I checked the rearview mirror. I checked the side mirrors. There was no one visible. The cargo space partition was closed, as it had been since Monza. The casket was sealed. The seal codes were MO7734, both wax stamps intact when I'd loaded it at 9:30. I pulled fully onto the hard shoulder at kilometer marker 64.3 on the A1 southbound. I stopped the vehicle. I turned off the engine. I sat there for 4 minutes and 30 seconds because I watched the dashboard clock, and it moved from 11:48 to 11:52 while I sat there without moving. The silence now was different from both the previous silences. It was ordinary. It was the silence of an empty vehicle on a motorway hard shoulder. I checked the cargo temperature display, 14.8 degrees Celsius, 0.8 above the loading baseline. The external temperature, according to the dashboard gauge, was 9.1 degrees Celsius. I noted all of this in the logbook. My handwriting is not normally shaky. You can see it in the entry for 11:52 on the 14th of October, 2006. The letters are irregular. The numbers are larger than usual. A forensic handwriting analyst would call it evidence of elevated stress response. I call it the handwriting of a man who had just heard something he had no category for. I sat on that hard shoulder for 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then I pulled back onto the motorway and I drove to Assisi. Because that was the job. Because Renato Gaspari was expecting a completion report by 6 in the evening. Because there was a family waiting at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, and they deserved to have their boy arrive on time. But I didn't turn the radio back on, and my hands did not stop shaking until I reached Parma. Over the next 40 kilometers, I tried every rational explanation I had access to. A radio frequency bleeding into the cab from an external source? Possible, but the radio had been off since before 11. A sound from outside the vehicle, a pedestrian or a passing car? Possible, but the voice was behind me, not to the side or ahead. An auditory hallucination resulting from low blood sugar, stress, or sleep deprivation? Possible. I had slept 6 hours the previous night. I had been awake since 5:45. I had eaten 1 tramezzino at 10:30. I filed it under probable stress response, possible auditory hallucination, to be monitored. I did not believe that filing, but I needed to drive, and I needed to deliver the boy to his family. And so I filed it, and I kept driving. The cargo temperature at the Parma area, kilometer marker 106 on the A1, was 15.1 degrees Celsius. The external temperature had dropped to 8.6 degrees. The cargo space was still gaining heat, minute by minute, in a sealed environment where no external heat source was present or active. At 14 degrees loading temperature, after 2 hours and 8 minutes of travel in 9-degree external conditions, a standard sealed cargo compartment in a Vito long wheelbase should have read approximately 13.2 to 13.5 degrees. I knew this because I had driven this vehicle for 2 years, and I had logged the temperature readings on every journey. 15.1 degrees was not possible. I logged it, and I drove. If what you've just heard has stirred something in you, and I believe it has, because these things reach a part of us that we don't always have words for, I want to give you something before I go on. I prepared a free novena to Carlo Acutis, completely free. 9 days of prayer inspired by his devotion to the Eucharist and his intercession for the young and the sick. It's in the description, the first link, right below this video. Download it and pray it for whoever you carry in your heart right now. But before you go, I need to tell you what was waiting for me at the gates of Assisi. Because what that mother said to me, what Antonia Salzano said, standing in the wind outside that basilica, is the thing that closed the first mystery. And it is the thing I have never been able to explain away. I arrived at Assisi at 15:53, 4 hours and 45 minutes after leaving Monza. The route from the A1 to Assisi took me through Foligno and up into the hills, the last section of road winding through olive groves and stone walls, the kind of landscape that makes you feel, even if you're not a believer, that you've crossed into a different kind of country. The gates of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore were flanked by a small group of people, perhaps 20 individuals, some in dark clothing, several with rosary beads visible, 2 priests in cassocks, a woman in her 40s, standing slightly apart from the group, who looked at the hearse as it turned into the approach road with an expression I had never seen on a family member's face before. She was not crying. She was watching. The way someone watches for someone they expect. I parked the vehicle in the designated area and got out. I had my transport documentation folder under my arm, reference MO200-61014ACU, and my identification badge from Bilotti. I walked toward the group. The woman came forward. She was wearing a dark wool coat, no gloves, and her hands were slightly red from the cold. She introduced herself. She said, "I'm Antonia, Carlo's mother." I shook her hand. I said I was sorry for her loss. These are the words you learn to say in my profession. They are not hollow. They are the minimum dignity you can offer a stranger in the worst week of their life. She said, "Thank you for bringing him." I said it had been a privilege. And then, and this is what I told you about, this is the second mystery I planted in your mind at the beginning. She said something that made every rational explanation I had been constructing since 1147 fall apart completely. She said, "He told us you'd be frightened on the road. He said to tell you that it's true. He said you'd know what that means." I stood at the gates of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Assisi on the afternoon of the 14th of October 2006, and I did not breathe for approximately 3 seconds. Because Antonia Salzano had not been in the hearse. She had not been on the A1 motorway at 1147. She had not been on the hard shoulder at kilometer marker 64.3. She did not know about the voice. She did not know about the cargo temperature readings. She did not know about my hands on the steering wheel. She could not know. She had spent the last 2 days in Assisi preparing for the interment. There was no possible channel of information between what had happened to me on that road and what she had just said to me. I asked her, and I asked carefully, trying to keep my voice level because my chest had gone tight in a way I associated with moments of extreme physical stress. I asked her when Carlo had said this. When, exactly? She said he had said it at the hospital, before he died. He had said, "The man who drives me to Assisi will be frightened on the road. Tell him it's true. He'll know." She said Carlo had been specific. He had said, "the man who drives me," not the drivers, not if someone is frightened. He had said it with the definiteness of a statement of fact. I asked her, and this is the question I have turned over in my mind for 19 years, how Carlo could have known there would be one driver, not two. Because Stefano had been scheduled to ride with me. Stefano had left at 9:55 that morning due to his son's illness. Until that moment, the transport manifest showed 2 operators on the route. Antonia looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Carlo knew a lot of things he shouldn't have been able to know." The cargo temperature at the time of arrival in Assisi, I checked it when I went back to the vehicle to prepare for the unloading, was 16.3 degrees Celsius. The external temperature in Assisi at 15:53 was 7.8 degrees Celsius. A sealed cargo compartment that had been loaded at 14 degrees, exposed to external conditions averaging between 8 and 10 degrees Celsius for 4 hours and 45 minutes, should have read between 12.9 and 13.4 degrees by every thermal calculation I had ever applied to this vehicle. 16.3 degrees. A gain of 2.3 degrees across a 4-hour, 45-minute journey in cold autumn conditions. I logged it. I completed the unloading. I handed the documentation folder to the officiating priest. I shook Antonia Salzano's hand again. I drove the 480 kilometers back to Monza in near silence, stopping once at Parma for fuel and coffee. I filed the transport report with Bilotti the following Monday morning. I described the temperature anomalies in the maintenance section. I described the hard shoulder stop as a momentary equipment check. I did not describe anything else. And then I put the memory in a locked room in my mind, and I told myself I would not go back there. But there was still the envelope. I had found it on the morning of the 14th, when Renato Gaspari handed me the transport documents at 8:15. It was clipped to the back of the documentation folder with a small binder clip. A small white envelope, sealed, with no stamp and no formal address. Just my name, Gianluca Ferretti, written on the front in black ballpoint pen, in a young person's handwriting, with the note beneath it, asterisk, "Open this when you are ready to believe." My name, not the Bilotti transport driver, not the hearse driver, my name. I had never met Carlo Acutis. He had died on the 12th of October. I was assigned to this transport on the morning of the 13th. No one at the funeral home had told anyone outside the family who would be driving the vehicle. I put the envelope in the inner breast pocket of my work jacket, and I wore it there all the way to Assisi and back. And when I got home that night, I put it in the drawer of my bedside table. And I didn't open it. Because the instructions said, when you are ready to believe. And I was not ready. I was not ready for a very long time. In the weeks after the transport, I told myself I would investigate. That was how I processed things that didn't fit my categories. I investigated. I gathered data. I formed hypotheses and tested them until one of them held. So I began with the temperature anomaly, because it was the thing I could quantify. The cargo compartment in Vehicle 7, the 2004 Mercedes-Benz Vito, registration L0498GH, used a passive thermal regulation system. No active heating or cooling in the cargo space. It was designed to maintain ambient temperature with minimal fluctuation to preserve the integrity of sealed transport in transit. The system was serviced every 6 months. The last service record, dated the 2nd of September 2006, 6 weeks before the transport, showed all thermal readings within manufacturer specifications. Maximum drift of 0.3 degrees per hour in standard conditions. 0.3 degrees per hour drift. Over 4 hours and 45 minutes, the maximum theoretical drift under the service specifications was approximately 1.4 degrees in either direction. A gain of 2.3 degrees was approximately 1.6 times the upper limit of the manufacturer's specified drift range. I contacted the Vito manufacturer's technical support line in Stuttgart. I explained the readings without giving context. I asked what could cause a gain of 2.3 degrees in a passive cargo compartment over 4 hours in 9-degree external conditions. The technician I spoke with, a man named Horst, whose last name I did not record, said there were 3 possible causes. 1, a malfunctioning sensor giving false high readings. 2, an external heat source in direct contact with the cargo compartment, such as a poorly lagged exhaust manifold bracket. 3, the cargo itself generating heat. He said option 3 was not, in his experience, applicable to standard funeral transport. I thanked him. I checked the exhaust manifold bracket on Vehicle 7 the following Tuesday. The vehicle was due for routine maintenance, and I had access to the service bay. The bracket insulation was intact. The thermal barrier between the exhaust system and the cargo compartment floor was within specification. Approximately 37 millimeters of composite insulation material, undamaged. The temperature readings were not a vehicle malfunction. The temperature readings were accurate. So I moved to the temperature of the body itself, because option 3, the one the Stuttgart technician had dismissed, was the one I couldn't stop thinking about. In standard forensic thanatology, the study of biological processes after death, a human body loses heat to the surrounding environment at a rate governed by the Marshall-Hoare formula, which calculates the rate of cooling based on environmental temperature, body mass, and clothing. At an environmental temperature of 14 degrees Celsius, a body of approximate mass 60 kilograms, which I estimated from the total casket weight of 84 kilograms, minus the standard oak casket weight of approximately 23 kilograms, should lose approximately 1.5 to 1.8 degrees Celsius per hour in the first 10 hours after death. Carlo Acutis had died at 06:45 on the 12th of October. I loaded the casket on the 14th of October at 9:30. That was a gap of approximately 50 hours and 45 minutes since death. After 50 hours, the body should have reached ambient temperature, the temperature of the environment in which it was stored, which in a hospital refrigeration unit would be between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius. A body stored at 3 to 5 degrees for 50 hours, then placed in a sealed casket in a cargo space at 14 degrees, should warm slowly toward ambient, but at the rate of the casket material warming, not the body. The body would not generate heat. The body cannot generate heat 50 hours after death. And yet the cargo compartment had gained 2.3 degrees across a journey in which it should have lost 1 to 2 degrees. I checked the thermometer calibration on Vehicle 7 in the service bay. The cargo temperature sensor read 14.0 degrees in a calibrated environment of 14 degrees. The sensor was accurate. I stood in the service bay on a Tuesday morning in late October 2006 with the calibration certificate in my hand, and the problem was worse than it had been, because now I had eliminated the equipment malfunction, and the numbers still said the same thing. A sealed cargo compartment, passive thermal system, confirmed accurate sensor, carrying a body dead for 50 hours, had gained 2.3 degrees over 4 hours and 45 minutes in 9-degree external conditions. That was, by every thermal model I could access, impossible. For the next several weeks, I added 2 more data checks. I called a professor of forensic pathology at the University of Milan. I found his name in a medical journal article on thanatology that I obtained from the Monza Public Library. I described the scenario in hypothetical terms, as a theoretical transport question, without identifying the deceased or the route. He confirmed the Marshall-Hoare calculation I had done. He added one refinement. In the case of a body with unusually high metabolic activity at the time of death, caused by some terminal conditions, including certain leukemias, there could be residual biochemical heat production for a period of up to 8 hours after death. Not 50 hours, 8 hours. He said at 50 hours, there was no known biological mechanism by which a human body could generate or radiate heat above its ambient storage temperature. He said my hypothetical was, and I quote from the notes I made during that call, thermodynamically incoherent. I put the phone down. I looked at the ceiling, and for the first time since I had filed the transport report, I let myself think the thing I had been refusing to think. If the temperature data was accurate, and the vehicle's thermal system was functioning correctly, and the body could not have been generating heat, then something else was generating heat in that cargo compartment. Something I had no instrument to measure. Something I had no category for. I did not open the envelope. I was not ready. If you downloaded the novena I mentioned earlier, you already know what I mean when I say that Carlo had a way of reaching people in the ordinary moments, the way he reached me, on a motorway, through a sealed partition, with a warmth I couldn't measure with any calibrated instrument I owned. If you haven't downloaded it yet, it's still there, the first link in the description, below this video. Pray it for whoever needs it most right now. And if these testimonies mean something to you, this is where I keep gathering them. But what I found in the following months, when I finally decided to learn who Carlo Acutis actually was, changed even the questions I was asking. Because the temperature in the hearse, it turned out, was the smallest part of what happened on that road. In the early months of 2007, I began to research, carefully, methodically, the way I'd approached every technical problem in my professional life. I was not looking for a miracle story. I was looking for information about a 15-year-old boy from Monza who had died of leukemia in October and who had somehow known my name. The first thing I found, and this would have been ordinary enough on its own, except that nothing about this case was ordinary, was a website. In the years before his death, Carlo Acutis had created and maintained an online database of Eucharistic miracles. Every documented case from the history of the Catholic Church in which the consecrated host had shown measurable physical anomalies, cases studied by scientists, cases with laboratory reports, cases with institutional verification. He had cataloged 146 cases. He had built a traveling exhibition that had been displayed in churches across multiple countries. He had done all of this between the ages of 11 and 15, in the years before his diagnosis, using skills he had largely taught himself. He called the Eucharist his highway to heaven. He was 15 years old, and he had created a scientific database of unexplained physical phenomena associated with religious experience. He was, in the language of faith, a boy who saw the world as a place where the visible and the invisible were permanently in contact. And he had done so with the methodological precision of someone who understood that evidence mattered, that data mattered, that if something was true, it should be possible to document it. I recognized something in that. Not the faith, not then, but the approach. I read everything I could find about him through the early months of 2007. I found an interview with Antonia Salzano from the Catholic News Service that described Carlo's daily habits. Mass every morning, 30-minute devotion before the Blessed Sacrament each day, rosary in the evenings, then hours of computer work. She described him as a boy who was simultaneously the most digitally engaged child of his generation and the most spiritually rooted person she had ever known. She described him as someone who spoke sometimes with a certainty about the future that she had not understood until after he was gone. She described one specific moment. In the summer of 2006, months before his diagnosis, Carlo had told her that he would offer his suffering when it came, for the Pope and for the Church. Not if it comes, when. He was 14 years old when he said that. In April 2007, I wrote a letter, an actual paper letter, because I had no direct contact information for the Acutis family, and I didn't trust email for something this personal, to the address listed for the Acutis family in a published interview. I explained that I was the driver who had transported Carlo from Monza to Assisi in October 2006. I said I had some questions and some information that might be relevant to whatever documentation the family was maintaining. I gave my return address in Monza. 6 weeks later, in early June 2007, I received a letter back. It was from a member of the family, not Antonia directly, but someone representing her interests. The letter confirmed that the family was aware of some unusual accounts from people who had been in contact with Carlo in the period around his death. The letter said that if I was willing to submit a written account of my experience, it would be included in the documentation being maintained for the formal ecclesiastical inquiry. Ecclesiastical inquiry. Those two words stopped me cold. I hadn't known until that letter that a formal process had already begun. But of course it had. Carlo Acutis was not simply a devout teenager. He was a boy about whom the Catholic Church was beginning to ask the question it only asks in the most serious cases. Could this person be a saint? I sat at my kitchen table in Monza on a June evening in 2007 with the letter in one hand and the envelope, which I had moved from the bedside drawer to the kitchen table sometime in February because I had been thinking about it more, in the other hand. I read the letter again. I looked at the envelope. I looked at my name in that young person's handwriting. I looked at the instruction, when you are ready to believe. I put the envelope back in the kitchen drawer, and I wrote the account. I described the temperature readings. I described the hard shoulder stop. I described what I heard. I described Antonia's words at the gates of the basilica. I described the envelope, that it existed, that it was sealed, that I had not opened it. I sent the account by registered mail to the address in the letter. I received a confirmation of receipt in July 2007. And then, nothing. The ecclesiastical process moved, as such processes do, at a pace that has nothing to do with the urgency a human being feels. Months passed. Years passed. I heard nothing more. I returned to my work. I drove other families, other routes. I got older. I tried to go back to being the man who didn't think about who was in the back. But I couldn't, quite, because of the temperature readings in the logbook, because of the entry at 11:52 on the 14th of October in shaky handwriting, because of the envelope in the drawer. The fourth thing, the thing I had noted and then pushed aside at kilometer marker 64.3, the thing I said I'd come back to, was this. I had started the journey at 10:08. I had made no stops until 11:48. In 1 hour and 40 minutes of continuous driving, the cargo temperature had risen from 14.0 degrees to 14.8 degrees, a rise of 0.8 degrees in 100 minutes. Under the manufacturer's specification of 0.3 degrees maximum drift per hour, 100 minutes should have shown a maximum drift of 0.5 degrees. The actual reading was 0.8. 60% above the specification ceiling, in conditions where the temperature should have been declining, not rising. The temperature had been climbing from the very first minute, not from when I heard the voice, from the start. 7 years after the transport, in October 2013, I was driving on the A1 again. Different vehicle, different route. I had moved from Bilotti to a larger regional funeral transport company, Trasporti Funebri Lombardi, where I was now a senior operator responsible for training new drivers on long-distance routes. That October, I heard news that stopped me in the middle of a route briefing I was giving to a trainee named Marco. A boy in Brazil, Campo Grande, 12 years old. His name was Mateus. He had a severe, life-threatening pancreatic malformation. His doctors had given him a median survival estimate of weeks. His mother, desperate, had heard of Carlo Acutis, whose cause for canonization was advancing through the Vatican. She had placed a card with Carlo's image on her son's abdomen and prayed. The malformation resolved. It did not slow down. It did not respond unexpectedly to treatment. It resolved. The doctors at the hospital in Campo Grande, Mato Grosso do Sul, Brazil, documented the case and submitted it to the Vatican as a potential miracle. The Vatican's medical board, composed of specialists including oncologists and gastroenterologists, examined the case files over the following months. Their conclusion, formal and filed. No known medical explanation. The healing was complete, instantaneous in clinical terms, and without precedent in the recorded literature for that type of malformation. This was the miracle that would become the basis for Carlo's beatification. I read about it in a Catholic news bulletin that a colleague's wife had left in the staff room. I read it 3 times. Then I went to the staff room window and looked at the parking lot for a long time. Because 12 years old, because a mother's prayer, because a card placed on an abdomen in a hospital room in Brazil by a woman who had never met this Italian boy from Monza who had died of leukemia at 15, 7 years earlier. Because, and this is the thing I had been circling around for 7 years, the thing the temperature readings and the voice and Antonia's words had been pointing toward without my being able to say it directly. What if the silence I had been carrying was not a story about an anomalous transport run? What if it was a story about a boy who was still doing what he had always done, being present, being warm, leaving traces, just from a different kind of distance? I went back to the drawer that evening. I stood over the envelope for a long time. Still not ready. In 2016, a decade after the transport, I retired from active long-distance driving. I had turned 57 that May, and the night drives and the physical loading and unloading were taking a toll I was no longer willing to ignore. I stayed on with Trasporti Funebri Lombardi in an administrative and training capacity. I moved from Monza to a smaller apartment in Lecco on the lake. The envelope came with me. It had a permanent spot now in the top drawer of the desk in what I was calling my study, a room that held my logbooks, my transport certifications, my training materials, and the accumulated paperwork of 31 years of driving the dead. I had, over those 10 years, allowed myself to read more about Carlo Acutis. I had read Antonia Salzano's book, Carlo Acutis, A Life Offered Up, in a library copy in 2008, and then I had bought my own copy, which was unusual for me. I had read the accounts of the teachers at his school in Milan, the Istituto Leone 13, who described him as a student of remarkable clarity and generosity. I had read accounts from his contemporaries, friends from the parish of Santa Maria Segreta in Milan, who described the same certainty, the same calm, the same sense that Carlo was operating from information that other people didn't have access to. One account particularly stayed with me. It came from an elderly Capuchin friar who had known Carlo in Assisi during a visit the family had made to the town, which the Acutises loved and visited regularly, long before it became Carlo's final resting place. The friar said that Carlo, on one of these visits, had walked around the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore with an expression of recognition, as if he already knew the building. The friar had asked him if he'd been there before. Carlo said he had, once. The friar checked with Antonia. It had been the family's first visit. Carlo had walked through the basilica where he would be buried, with the expression of someone returning. I read this in my apartment in Lecco on a February evening in 2019, and something shifted. Not dramatically, not with a flash of light or a sudden conversion, just a shift. The way a long-closed lock turns over when someone finally finds the right key and applies just enough pressure. I got up from the desk. I went to the top drawer. I took out the envelope. I turned it over in my hands. I looked at my name on the front. I looked at the instruction, "When you are ready to believe." I put it back in the drawer. 3 more days. In March 2019, the church authorized the exhumation of Carlo Acutis' body at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore for the purposes of formal recognition ahead of his beatification. The exhumation team, physicians, theologians, representatives of the local diocese, representatives of the Acutis family, opened the tomb on April 4th, 2019, 12 years and 5 months after the interment. The news report I read described their finding. The body was found to be in a state of preservation inconsistent with the passage of 12 years in a standard burial environment. The report used the formal theological term, *integrum, intact. The flesh was preserved. The features were recognizable. 12 years and 5 months. 14 degrees Celsius at loading temperature on the 14th of October 2006, gaining to 16.3 degrees by the time I reached Assisi. I don't know what the connection is. I am not a theologian. I am not a pathologist. I am a retired funeral transport driver with a Class E certification and 31 years of logbooks in a filing cabinet in Lecco. I cannot tell you what the temperature readings mean in relation to the condition of the body 12 years later. I can only tell you what the logbook says and what the exhumation report says, and that the numbers are what they are. What I can tell you is this. I read the exhumation news on a laptop screen in my study, at the desk with the drawer that held the envelope. And when I finished reading it, I opened the drawer, I opened the envelope. I had carried it for 12 years and 5 months. 12 years and 5 months without opening it. And inside was a single sheet of white paper, folded once, in the same black ballpoint handwriting as the name on the front. It said, "Gianluca, don't be afraid. Everything is fine. The warmth you feel is real. Assisi is where I always wanted to be. When you open this, it will be the year the church opens the tomb. Come to Assisi and see. I'll be there." And at the bottom, a date. The date was the 14th of October, 2006, the day of the transport, the day Carlo Acutis had already been dead for 48 hours. He had written this note before he died, dated it the day of the transport, knowing I would carry him, knowing my name, knowing that I would hear something on the road, knowing that I would not open the envelope until the year the tomb was opened, and specifying in 5 words that were the same 5 words I had heard behind the partition at kilometer marker 64.3. Don't be afraid. Everything is fine. That this moment was already waiting for me. The date on the note, 14th of October, 2006. The year of the exhumation, 2019. The 13 years between those 2 dates, the years I had carried this without understanding it. I sat at my desk in Lecco with the note in my hand for a very long time. Then I booked a train ticket to Assisi. I arrived in Assisi on the 15th of April, 2019, 11 days after the exhumation. The basilica was open for visitation, though the body had been placed in a temporary reliquary while the beatification preparations continued. I walked into the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore at 9:47 in the morning. The air inside was cool and still. There were perhaps 30 people present, some tourists, some pilgrims, several elderly women in prayer, candles burning at 3 separate altars, the smell of old stone and incense. I walked to the area where Carlo's tomb had been located, and I stood there. I had the note in my jacket pocket, the inner breast pocket, the same pocket where I'd carried the envelope for 12 years. And I thought about the Capuchin friar's account of Carlo walking through this basilica with the expression of someone returning. And I thought about Antonia at the gates, in the wind, saying, "He told us you'd be frightened." And I thought, of all the places I could have been brought, in 31 years of driving, in 3,000 plus transports across Lombardy and beyond, what were the odds that the one transport that broke every category I possessed would bring me here, to this particular church, in this particular hill town, with a note in my pocket that had been written by a boy who had died before I left for work that morning? There are no odds for that. Probability doesn't have a denominator large enough. I am not a theologian, but I know what it feels like when the data stops being manageable. When you have tested every variable, eliminated every alternative, calibrated every instrument, and the reading still says what it says. I sat in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore for 47 minutes. When I stood up to leave, I don't have a better word for this, lighter. The way you feel when you've been carrying a weight for a very long time and someone finally tells you that you're allowed to put it down. I walked out into the April sunlight of Assisi, and I called my sister, who had been a practicing Catholic her entire life and who had been waiting with remarkable patience for me to have this conversation for years. I told her what had happened. I told her about the note. I told her about the temperature readings. I told her about 1147 on the A1 motorway. She cried. She is not by temperament someone who cries easily. She said, 13 years, Gianluca. 13 years I prayed for you. I said, I know. I think Carlo knew too. The beatification of Carlo Acutis took place on the 10th of October 2020 at the Basilica of San Francisco in Assisi. Pope Francis presided. The decree recognized the miracle of Mateus in Campo Grande, Brazil, the boy with the pancreatic malformation, as meeting the requirements of the canonical process: inexplicable, instantaneous, complete, permanent. The panel of Vatican medical consultants who reviewed the case included 11 specialists. Their vote was unanimous. I watched the ceremony on a television screen in my sister's house in Bergamo. She had cooked and invited the family. There were 11 of us around the table. I had never spent a religious observance with family before, not as a participant, not as someone who was present in any meaningful sense. I was there for the food and because my sister had asked. But I was watching. And when the image of Carlo Acutis appeared on the screen, a photograph, the familiar one, in jeans and a green sweatshirt, smiling the smile of someone who has no idea he'll be a saint someday, or perhaps every idea. Something in my chest did a thing I couldn't classify. Not grief, not fear, something closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who has been reading a very long book and has finally reached the page where all the threads come together. The second miracle, the one that would be required for canonization, came in 2022. Valeria Valverde, Costa Rica. A young woman who had suffered severe head trauma and was in a state her doctors described as incompatible with recovery. Her family prayed for Carlo's intercession. The recovery was, in the clinical language of the Vatican's medical board, inexplicable by the known laws of medicine and surgery. The board voted unanimously. The canonization date was announced, September 7th, 2025, Jubilee year. Pope Leo XIV presiding. I attended the canonization in Rome. I had booked the travel in January 2025, the moment the date was confirmed. Flights from Milan to Rome, accommodation in Trastevere, 3 nights. I stood in St. Peter's Square on the 7th of September with approximately 60,000 other people, and I watched Carlo Acutis become a saint of the Universal Church. The square was enormous, and my view of the ceremony was distant, but I had my logbook with me, the original logbook from 2006, reference number LO-14th of October 2006, with the entry at 11:52 in the shaky handwriting. I had the note in my inner breast pocket. I had the transport documentation, reference MO-2006-1014 ACU, folded into the back of the logbook. When the moment came, when Pope Leo XIV spoke the words of canonization, and the crowd's response moved through 60,000 people like a wave, I felt the same thing I had felt in the cargo space of Vehicle 7 on the A1 motorway 18 years before. Not dramatically, not with thunder or light, just warmth, just presence, just the clear, calm sense that something true was being confirmed. 5 words. Don't be afraid. Everything is fine. The first millennial saint, God's influencer, the patron saint of the internet, who had cataloged 146 Eucharistic miracles and offered his suffering for the Pope and the Church, who had known the name of a funeral driver he had never met, who had written a note dated the day of his own transport and sealed it with instructions that spanned 13 years. He was right. It was all fine. I give talks now, mostly to Catholic parishes in the Lombardy region, sometimes in other parts of Italy. In November 2024, I was invited to speak at a conference in Dublin on the modern witness testimony process, how ordinary people who have had extraordinary contact with the lives of the saints document and submit their accounts. I brought the logbook, I brought the note, I brought the transport documentation. After the talk in Dublin, a woman came up to me. She was perhaps 70 years old, a retired school teacher from Galway, she told me, with the particular quality of stillness that I have come to associate with people who have been praying for a very long time. She said she had a grandson who was ill, not leukemia, something neurological, something the doctors were managing but not, she said, resolving. She asked if Carlo was still listening. I told her what I believed, that a boy who could write a note in October 2006 to a man he had never met, dated it for a journey that hadn't yet happened, and specified the year the tomb would open, that kind of boy doesn't stop paying attention. She took out a small card with Carlo's image on it and held it in both hands. She closed her eyes. I stood next to her in a conference room in Dublin, and I didn't say anything, because there are moments when the most honest thing you can do is be quiet. I thought about kilometer marker 64.3. I thought about the shaky handwriting in the logbook. I thought about Antonia in the wind at the gates of the basilica, saying, "He told us you'd be frightened." I thought about how 19 years is a long time to carry something without opening it, and how the right moment is the right moment, and not any of the other moments that feel like it might be the moment, but aren't. The cargo temperature at arrival in Assisi had been 16.3 degrees Celsius, in 9-degree external conditions, over 4 hours and 45 minutes of sealed transport. The sensor calibrated at 14.0 degrees in the service bay 8 days later. I have never found an explanation. I stopped looking for one in 2019. What I have found, and I want to be precise about this, because precision matters, and I have spent 31 years valuing it. What I have found is this. There are kinds of evidence that don't fit into a logbook or a calibration certificate. There are readings that exceed every instrument you own. And when you've eliminated every possible alternative, when the sensor is calibrated and the thermal barrier is intact, and the Marshall-Hoare formula has been applied correctly, and the answer still doesn't fit, then the question is no longer what kind of anomaly you are measuring. The question is what kind of presence you are in. I drove Carlo Acutis from Monza to Assisi on the 14th of October 2006. 480 kilometers, 4 hours and 45 minutes on the A1 motorway in autumn light. I heard 5 words behind a sealed partition at 11:47. The cargo compartment gained 2.3 degrees in cold conditions, and no technical explanation has ever been found. I stayed silent for 19 years. Now you know. All of it. Every measurement, every kilometer marker, every temperature reading in the logbook, every word on the note. All of it. Carlo Acutis said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. I think the road from Monza to Assisi was something like that, on a Saturday in October, 18 years ago. A stretch of highway where the visible and the invisible were, for 4 hours and 45 minutes, in the same vehicle. I'm glad I was the driver. If this testimony has marked you as deeply as those 19 years marked me, I ask you one simple thing. Subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. On Traces of Heaven, we keep gathering the traces that Carlo left all over the world, and the people ordinary enough and brave enough to finally tell what they saw. If you want to carry something of this story with you, the free novena is in the description, the first link right below this video. Download it, pray it for 9 days, share it with someone you love, and keep his memory alive. Carlo Acutis said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look.